January 29, 2020. Workers arrive at the magnificent Donington Hall estate in Leicestershire, expecting another day of building premium British motorcycles. Instead, they find the heavy iron gates chained shut. Administrators from BDO stand guard. The CEO has vanished. A historic empire is frozen overnight. This wasn't just any company. This was Norton. For over a century, these machines were the unapproachable masters of the Isle of Man TT, and a proud symbol of the British crown. Now that glittering legacy has been reduced to the center of the most ruthless pension fraud scandal in modern British history. Millions gone. How does a mechanical titan survive 2 world wars, only to orchestrate its own destruction? And more bafflingly, how did it die not just once in the 1970s, but repeat the exact same tragic collapse 4 decades later? This is the dark history of Norton motorcycles. A cautionary tale of brilliant engineering, blinding national pride, and the devastating human cost when absolute greed takes the wheel. The year is 1898. Birmingham, England, is the beating, soot-stained heart of the global industrial revolution. Amidst the deafening noise of foundries and the relentless march of progress, James Lansdowne Norton, known affectionately as Pa to those who worked alongside him, founds the Norton Manufacturing Company. Initially, it is just a modest operation producing bicycle parts and chains. But James Norton is a visionary, deeply infected by the intoxicating promise of motorized transport. By 1902, the very first Norton motorcycle rolls out onto the cobbled streets, utilizing a French Clement engine. However, Norton is not a man interested in simply buying parts and bolting them together. He wants to engineer a soul. He demands absolute mechanical supremacy. Though plagued by poor health for much of his life, his obsession with precision is unwavering. He wants to build machines that do not just carry a rider, but elevate them. The true test of a motorcycle's soul in the early 20th century is not found in city commuting. It is found on a treacherous, winding island in the middle of the Irish Sea. The Isle of Man TT is a grueling 37-mile circuit of mountain roads, unforgiving stone walls, and sheer drops where a single mechanical failure often means a fatal crash. In 1907, a rider named Rem Fowler takes a twin-cylinder Norton to the inaugural Isle of Man TT race. Against all odds, he wins. That single victory irreversibly forges the DNA of the company. From that moment on, racing is never just a marketing department for Norton, it becomes their religion. By 1908, James Norton designs his own single-cylinder engine, the legendary Big Four. Over the next 2 decades, the machines become so incredibly fast, so reliable, and so utterly dominant on the track that the British press coins a moniker that will stick for half a century: the unapproachable Norton. Nobody can catch them. They are the undisputed royalty of the asphalt, building temperamental but brilliant machines that demand respect and ruthlessly punish the untalented. This hard-earned reputation for indestructible engineering eventually catches the attention of the ultimate, most demanding client in the world: the British military. When the dark, ominous clouds of the Second World War gather over Europe, the British War Office needs a machine that can survive the absolute hell of the modern battlefield. Norton answers the call with the Model 16H. Between 1937 and 1945, the Bracebridge Street factory in Birmingham transforms into an unrelenting wartime production engine. The facility becomes a deafening hive of patriotism and industry. Workers toil day and night, their hands perpetually blackened by grease, their ears ringing from the constant rhythmic hammering of heavy metal presses. Over 100,000 of these rugged, single-cylinder workhorses are produced. They are dropped into combat zones, ridden through deep mud, freezing snow, and heavy enemy fire by military dispatch riders. The 16H cements Norton not just as a racing champion, but as a critical pillar of the British Empire's industrial might. They do not just build motorcycles, they help win a global war. The post-war era brings an insatiable, worldwide hunger for speed, and Norton delivers its absolute masterpiece, the Manx. Designed specifically to conquer the Isle of Man TT once again, the Manx Norton is a mechanical marvel. But its true genius is unlocked in 1950 when two brothers, Rex and Chromie McCandless, design a revolutionary motorcycle frame for the company. They call it the featherbed frame. It is an absolute revelation in handling and geometry. While other motorcycles of the era violently wobble and force the rider into a wrestling match at high speeds, the featherbed makes the Manx glide, as if on rails. Legendary racers like Jeff Duke ride the featherbed Manx to consecutive world championships. Throughout the entire decade of the 1950s, the unwritten rule of the paddock is simple. If you are not riding a Norton, you are simply not going to win. They are the undisputed kings of the global racing circuit, the absolute pinnacle of British engineering pride, and the envy of every other manufacturer on Earth. But beneath the deafening roar of the victorious exhaust notes, a silent structural rot is beginning to take root. The featherbed frame and the Manx engines are brilliant, undeniably so, but they are the products of obsessive old-world craftsmanship. Norton does not have highly efficient modern assembly lines. They have artisans. Master craftsmen painstakingly weld, tune, frame, and assemble each individual motorcycle by hand in the cramped, aging, and increasingly decrepit Bracebridge Street facility. The machines they produce are magnificent works of art, but they are incredibly expensive to manufacture and painfully slow to build. The directors sitting in the boardroom are men of the old guard. They are blinded by the blinding glare of their own silver trophies. They look at their racing ledgers and see perfection. They believe that racing dominance automatically equates to commercial immortality. Why invest millions in new manufacturing machinery? Why redesign the core engine block when the current one is still winning world championships? Why modernize a factory when the current one survived the Blitz? They are entirely convinced that as long as they build the best handling motorcycles in the world, the public will patiently wait in line and gladly pay whatever premium price is asked. They are building bespoke masterpieces in an era that is rapidly pivoting toward mass consumer production. The world outside the factory walls is about to change gears, but Norton, deeply intoxicated by its own unapproachable legend, refuses to look in the rearview mirror. By the mid-1960s, the cracks in the British motorcycle industry are beginning to show, though few executives are willing to admit it. The global market, particularly the massive wealthy consumer base in the United States, is demanding more power, greater speed, and larger engines. Norton responds the only way it knows how, by taking its aging pre-war parallel twin engine design and stretching its capacity to the absolute limit. They bore it out to 750 cubic centimeters to create the Norton Atlas. The Atlas is undeniably fast, but it possesses a fatal bone-rattling flaw. As the engine grows larger, the mechanical vibrations become almost intolerable. At highway speeds, the Atlas shakes so violently that it numbs the rider's hands, blurs their vision in the mirrors, and literally vibrates nuts and bolts right off the metal chassis. It is a brilliant machine desperately trying to tear itself apart. The company urgently needs a revolution, but the boardroom, tight-fisted and deeply conservative, outright refuses to invest the massive capital required to design a completely new, modern engine from scratch. They demand an engineering miracle on a shoestring budget. In 1967, a small team of brilliant engineers, including former Rolls-Royce man Dr. Stephen Bauer, alongside Bob Trigg and Bernard Hooper, deliver exactly that. If they cannot afford to fix the vibrating engine, they decide they will simply isolate it. They invent a revolutionary mounting system called Isolastic. Instead of bolting the violently shaking engine directly to a rigid metal frame, they suspend the engine, transmission, and swing arm together on a complex series of rubber bushings. It is an act of sheer engineering, sleight of hand. When the rider twists the heavy throttle, the massive twin engine still shakes furiously, but the rubber mounts absorb the kinetic energy before it reaches the frame. The rider feels nothing but smooth, uninterrupted, surging power gliding across the pavement. The team wraps this ingenious mechanical system in a stunning, forward-leaning design, featuring a sleek fiberglass tail and a beautifully sculpted fuel tank. They call it the Norton Commando. Unveiled at the 1967 Earl's Court Motor Show in London, the Commando is an absolute sensation. It is not just a motorcycle. It is a cultural event that perfectly captures the rebellious, high-octane spirit of the late 1960s. When it finally hits the streets the following year, the global motorcycling press is universally stunned. It handles with the legendary World Championship precision of the old featherbed frames, but with a level of cruising comfort previously unimaginable on a large British twin. It launches off the line with a thunderous, throaty roar, leaving bewildered competitors eating its dust. For an unprecedented 5 consecutive years, from 1968 to 1972, the Norton Commando wins the highly prestigious Motorcycle News Machine of the Year award. It rapidly dominates the highly lucrative American export market. Dealerships from the sun-drenched coast of California to the busy streets of New York simply cannot keep them on the showroom floors. It becomes the ultimate symbol of cool, ridden by Hollywood actors, rock stars, and outlaws alike. The Commando is universally hailed as the absolute pinnacle of British motorcycling, the undisputed, glamorous king of the open road. But this glittering crown hides a terminal illness. The Commando is a magnificent illusion. The isoelastic frame is a brilliant band-aid slapped over a gaping, bleeding wound. The engine beating at its heart is still an antiquated, pushrod design that traces its direct lineage back to the late 1940s. It leaks oil habitually, requires constant, meticulous mechanical maintenance, and is being pushed to the absolute edge of its thermal and physical limits. More devastatingly, the Berimagus Baby more devastating than the environment in which these world-beating machines are actually built is a grim picture of industrial decay. The executives sitting in their comfortable, benaut, negligible wood-paneled offices are funneling the massive profits generated by the Commando into shareholder dividends and separate corporate ventures, actively starving the manufacturing floor of desperate, overdue investment. The workers tasked with building the greatest motorcycle in the world are operating heavy machinery that literally predates the Second World War. The factory tooling is severely worn down, resulting in wildly inconsistent manufacturing tolerances from one bike to the next. The factory floors are dark, cramped, and covered in decades of grime. There is a catastrophic, growing disconnect between the aristocratic management class and the blue-collar workers sweating on the assembly line. While the directors toast to record-breaking sales figures in America, the men building the bikes are heavily unionized, chronically underpaid, and increasingly furious at their working conditions. Strikes and sudden walkouts become frequent occurrences, violently disrupting production schedules and creating massive delays in international shipping. Quality control begins to plummet dangerously. Customers who pay an absolute premium for the legendary Norton badge increasingly find themselves on the side of the road with broken clutch cables or constantly wiping up pools of black oil from their garage floors. Yet, the leadership remains utterly blind to the impending crisis. They believe the massive success of the Commando has permanently secured their empire for another century. They look down upon the rest of the world, supremely confident that British engineering is inherently untouchable. They do not realize that while they are relying on pre-war machine tools and clever rubber bushings to sell an aging engine, an entirely new era of manufacturing is quietly preparing to cross the ocean. An era defined by clinical robotic precision, massive corporate investment, and absolute push-button reliability. The British Lion is roaring loudly, completely oblivious to the fact that a relentless, mechanical sun is about to rise in the east. In 1969, the Earth shifts violently beneath the feet of the British motorcycle industry, though the initial tremors are felt half a world away. At the Tokyo Motor Show, a Japanese manufacturer unveils a machine that effectively rewrites the laws of physics, engineering, and economics for two-wheeled transportation. It is the Honda CB750. Until this exact moment in history, a large-capacity motorcycle is universally understood to be a vibrating, oil-leaking parallel twin that demands constant maintenance and requires a heavy, muscular kickstart to roar to life. The Honda shatters every single one of those antiquated paradigms overnight. It features a transverse inline four-cylinder engine that revs with the smooth, turbine-like precision of a commercial aircraft. It boasts a highly reliable electric starter. A rider simply presses a small button on the handlebar, and the engine hums perfectly to life without breaking a sweat. It introduces a hydraulic front disc brake for stopping power that entirely outclasses anything currently being built in Europe. And crucially, when parked in a clean garage, it does not leave a single drop of oil on the concrete floor. The CB750 is not just a new model of motorcycle. It is a declaration of industrial war. It is mass-produced using clinical, highly automated assembly lines that guarantee absolute precision and completely identical manufacturing tolerances for every single unit rolling off the factory floor. Honda can produce these mechanical marvels at a volume and a retail price point that makes the hand-built British machines look absurdly expensive, entirely impractical, and painfully primitive. How does the leadership at Norton, sitting comfortably in their wood-paneled offices in England, react to this technological atomic bomb? With staggering, almost comical arrogance. The British motorcycling establishment looks at the intricate Japanese four-cylinder engines and dismisses them entirely. They derisively call them disposable toys and soulless sewing machines. There is a deep, toxic pride ingrained in the British engineering psyche. The executives firmly believe that a true motorcycle must have character, which is essentially their corporate euphemism for oil leaks, heavy vibrations, and the necessity of constant mechanical tinkering. They assume that the hardcore American riders, who make up their most lucrative export customer base, will never abandon the masculine, raw, visceral thrill of a Norton Commando for a quiet, civilized, and overly complicated Japanese machine. But the American consumer is not bound by British nostalgia, nor do they share this romanticized view of mechanical failure. When the Honda CB750 and the subsequent wave of Japanese superbikes from Kawasaki and Suzuki hit dealership floors in the United States, it triggers a mass extinction event for European imports. Riders are utterly captivated. They quickly discover that they can purchase a motorcycle that goes faster, stops quicker, costs significantly less, and most importantly, actually starts every single morning without fail. Before 1969, riding a heavy British twin required the mechanical knowledge of a seasoned engineer and the physical strength of an athlete to overcome the massive engine compression. The Japanese manufacturers democratize speed. Anyone with a checkbook can now buy a superbike, push a button, and comfortably cruise at 100 miles per hour. Riders no longer have to spend their entire weekends covered in thick grease-fixing broken clutch cables. They can actually spend their weekends riding. Dealerships from California to New York that once proudly displayed the Norton Commando in their pristine front windows begin pushing the British twins to the dusty back corners of the shop to make room for the glittering, flawless new machines arriving in shipping containers from Japan. Norton attempts to fight back, but their industrial arsenal is terrifyingly empty. They try to squeeze even more horsepower out of the aging Commando engine, eventually pushing it to 850 cubic centimeters in a desperate bid to match the top speed of the new Japanese superbikes. But the laws of physics are a cruel and unforgiving judge. The older engine architecture simply cannot handle the increased mechanical stress. The isoelastic frame, once hailed as an absolute miracle of vibration control, requires precise, constant shimming and adjustment by the owner. If neglected, the handling becomes terrifyingly unstable at highway speeds. Warranty claims begin to pile up on the executives' desks at an alarming rate. Main bearings fail prematurely. Gearboxes shatter under the immense torque. Norton is not losing the global market war because they suddenly forgot how to build motorcycles. They are losing because they are fighting a modern, highly mechanized army using muskets and cavalry. The sun is rising rapidly in the east, casting a very long, very cold shadow over the stagnant island. While the relentless external threat from Japan is ruthlessly dismantling Norton's market share abroad, a far more insidious poison is destroying the company from within. The early 1970s plunged Great Britain into a severe, unprecedented era of industrial and economic turmoil. The nation is completely paralyzed by rampant global inflation, soaring energy costs triggered by the oil crisis, and an incredibly toxic, combative relationship between aristocratic corporate management and militant labor unions. Norton finds itself trapped in the dead center of this national industrial warfare. Inside the historic Norton manufacturing facilities, the daily working conditions have deteriorated from grim to downright hazardous. The men standing on the assembly line are subjected to freezing drafts in the bitter winter, suffocating heat in the summer, and the constant deafening roar of outdated, failing machinery that has not been replaced since the war. They are tasked with building a premium luxury product for the wealthy American market, yet they are paid dismal, stagnant wages that are rapidly being eroded by double-digit domestic inflation. Resentment quickly boils over onto the production floor. The heavily unionized workforce begins to weaponize their labor as their only means of leverage. Frequent, unannounced wildcat strikes shatter any remaining semblance of a reliable production schedule. A master mechanic might tighten an engine bolt perfectly on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning, walk off the line in a furious wage dispute, leaving half-assembled motorcycles rusting on the stationary conveyor belts for weeks at a time. This internal chaos is catastrophically compounded by a complete collapse of the broader British manufacturing supply chain. Norton does not build every single component of their motorcycles in-house. They rely heavily on a vast, interconnected network of external British suppliers for vital parts like electrical wiring systems, carburetors, brake calipers, and speedometer gauges. But these third-party supplier companies are suffering from the exact same terminal disease: massive corporate underinvestment, severely outdated tooling, and constant labor strikes. The electrical systems, universally infamous among riders for failing in the rain, and jokingly referred to as the Prince of Darkness, become a massive liability. Carburetors wear out prematurely straight out of the box. Norton's own assembly lines are frequently forced to a complete agonizing halt simply because a supplier across town has gone on strike and stopped delivering taillights. The broader industrial climate in Britain eventually devolves into a literal nightmare. The crisis peaks with the national coal miners' strikes and the infamous implementation of the 3-day week by the Conservative government in early 1974. To aggressively conserve dwindling national coal stockpiles, commercial electricity consumption is strictly mandated to just 3 specific days a week. It is a scenario that defies belief. Imagine a company desperately attempting to manufacture a high-performance, precision-engineered superbike to compete with Honda, only for the power to the heavy lathes and metal presses to be abruptly cut off on a Thursday afternoon. Highly skilled workers are reduced to helplessly sweeping floors or attempting to blindly assemble complex engine blocks using battery-powered flashlights and dim gas lamps. The sheer absurdity of trying to fight the highly automated, hyper-efficient Japanese megafactories while literally sitting in the dark in the West Midlands highlights the profound, systemic tragedy of the situation. The boardroom responds to this cascading multi-front crisis with a lethal combination of panic, denial, and paralysis. Instead of immediately cutting bloated executive salaries at the top or liquidating non-essential corporate assets to invest heavily in modernizing the factory floor, the directors attempt to squeeze even more blood from the stone. They ruthlessly pressure the remaining, exhausted workforce to speed up assembly to make up for the time lost to blackouts and strikes. This mandate inevitably leads to a disastrous plunge in build quality. Motorcycles are hastily crated and shipped across the Atlantic with missing structural bolts, incorrectly wired electrical harnesses, and engines that leak oil before they are even started by the customer. The legendary Norton badge, once the ultimate undisputed symbol of British racing supremacy and mechanical perfection, is rapidly becoming a tragic punchline in the global motorcycling community. The company is bleeding liquid cash at an entirely unsustainable rate. They are completely outgunned by the Japanese on the racetrack, hopelessly outmaneuvered in the showroom floors, and structurally collapsing under the weight of their own factory roofs. The unapproachable master has suddenly become completely immobile, and the stage is set for a systemic, catastrophic collapse that will soon drag the entire British motorcycle industry into the abyss. By the summer of 1973, the British motorcycle industry is not merely declining, it is standing on the absolute precipice of total annihilation. The financial hemorrhage across the entire sector is so catastrophic that it threatens tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs, prompting sheer panic in the hallowed halls of Westminster. The British government, completely desperate to prevent a massive, humiliating industrial collapse on the global stage, decides to forcefully intervene in the free market. The Conservative government orchestrates a desperate, highly subsidized shotgun marriage between the two remaining deeply wounded titans of the industry, the massively indebted BSA Triumph Group and the Norton Villiers Company. This newly consolidated government-backed entity is christened Norton Villiers Triumph, or NVT. It is placed under the chairmanship of Dennis Poor, a ruthless, aristocratic industrialist and former racing driver known for his unsentimental approach to corporate restructuring. From the very beginning, this is not a strategic, forward-thinking alliance born of mutual innovation. It is a chaotic, desperate consolidation of massive debt, severely outdated machinery, and bitter corporate rivals. Poor is handed an impossible, inherently contradictory mandate: streamline production, eliminate vast redundancies, and somehow build a unified, globally competitive mega-corporation out of three distinct motorcycle brands that have spent the last half-century fiercely hating each other. The Norton men view the Triumph men with deep suspicion, and the BSA engineers deeply resent them all. The immediate strategy for corporate survival is brutal, but mathematically necessary. NVT simply cannot afford to keep all of its sprawling, highly inefficient factories open while Japanese imports are actively devouring their market share. In September 1973, management announces a sweeping reorganization plan that includes the permanent, immediate closure of the historic Triumph manufacturing plant in Meriden. The corporate plan is to coldly strip the heavy machinery from the Meriden floors, terminate the workforce, and consolidate all future production into the existing Norton BSA facility in Small Heath, Birmingham. It is a calculated, clinical boardroom decision designed entirely to cut overhead costs and appease nervous government auditors. But the boardroom executives, viewing the world exclusively through the lens of profit and loss balance sheets, entirely miscalculate the fierce, deeply entrenched pride of the British working class. The workers at Meriden do not simply clock out, accept their standard redundancy notices, and go quietly into the night. Instead, they initiate one of the most extraordinary, devastating, and globally publicized labor actions in British industrial history. They physically lock the heavy iron gates of the Meriden plant from the inside. They weld heavy steel barricades across the loading docks. They seize complete physical control of the entire factory complex and firmly refuse to leave. This is not a standard, peaceful picket line held outside the company property. It is a full-scale, deeply entrenched industrial siege. The Meriden blockade immediately and fatally paralyzes the newly formed NVT. Inside the barricaded Triumph facility sit thousands of nearly completed motorcycles, essential, irreplaceable manufacturing tooling, and millions of pounds worth of vital engine components that are desperately needed to keep the other NVT assembly lines moving. The government-engineered megacorporation is suddenly entirely starved of its own lifeblood. Norton production in Wolverhampton and Birmingham grinds to an agonizing, devastating halt because they simply cannot access the necessary parts to finish building their own motorcycles. Dealerships across the United States, who still have loyal customers willing to buy British twins, are screaming into their telephones for inventory, but NVT has absolutely nothing to ship. While Honda and Kawasaki are aggressively flooding American showrooms with thousands of highly reliable electric start superbikes every single week, capturing the global market share forever, the British motorcycle industry is literally holding itself hostage behind a chain-link fence in the West Midlands. The Meriden blockade drags on for 18 agonizing, deeply destructive months. It becomes a highly politicized media spectacle featuring defiant workers huddled around burning oil drums in the freezing winter, while furious NVT executives desperately petition the government for police intervention. It is a slow, excruciating financial strangulation for the entire company. By the time the standoff is finally resolved and a workers' cooperative is established at Meriden in 1975, the global motorcycle market has permanently, irreversibly moved on. The vital, highly lucrative American export market, which had been the absolute economic foundation of the British industry since the end of the Second World War, has been completely conquered by the Japanese manufacturers. Dealerships that once proudly flew the Norton flag in their showroom windows have long since switched their allegiances to Yamaha and Suzuki, simply to keep their businesses alive. They cannot sell nostalgia, and they certainly cannot sell motorcycles that are physically trapped behind a picket line an ocean away. In a desperate final bid for survival, Norton engineers rush to release the Commando 850 Mark III. They finally attempt to add modern features like an electric starter and a left-side gear shift to comply with strict new American federal safety regulations. But because the company is entirely starved of research and development funding, the electric starter is woefully under-engineered. It routinely burns out and fails to turn the heavy engine over, serving as a tragic, highly visible, mechanical metaphor for the company itself. Dennis Poor desperately attempts to navigate the rapidly sinking NVT ship through this perfect economic storm, but the external political climate shifts decisively against him. A new Labour government takes power in Britain, bringing with it a radically different economic philosophy regarding failing national industries. They look at the staggering, constantly mounting financial losses of Norton Villiers' Triumph and make a cold, calculating political decision. The era of writing massive blank state subsidy checks to prop up failing heritage industries is officially over. In the summer of 1975, the government abruptly withdraws its financial guarantees, immediately pulling the life support plug on the entire NVT operation. The financial collapse is swift, ruthless, and absolute. Norton Villiers' Triumph is forced into catastrophic receivership. The sprawling, historic factories that once deafened entire neighborhoods with the proud, rhythmic hammering of industrial presses fall hauntingly, permanently silent. The legendary Norton Commando, a Lady Norning de Remerimo, a magnificent machine that had won Machine of the Year 5 consecutive times and captured the imagination of a generation, abruptly ceases production. By 1977, the final corporate assets are completely liquidated. The remaining heavy tooling, the very machinery that built the unapproachable racing champions and the motorcycles that helped win the Second World War, is unceremoniously auctioned off to the highest bidder for mere scrap value. Thousands of highly skilled engineers, master mechanics, and dedicated assembly line workers walk out of the factory gates for the very last time, their livelihoods entirely erased by a cascading failure of arrogant corporate management, militant labor relations, and misguided political intervention. Norton, the unapproachable master, the mechanical titan that had conquered the Isle of Man TT and built the foundation of British motorcycling pride, is officially dead. The roaring engines are silenced forever, the assembly lines are completely dismantled, and the once mighty global brand is reduced to nothing more than a ghostly, forgotten trademark written on a dusty piece of paper in a liquidator's filing cabinet. For 3 long decades, the Norton name will lie completely dormant in the dark shadows of history, a tragic, textbook casualty of British industrial stubbornness. It is the definitive end of a legendary empire. But as history will tragically prove, it is only the first time this iconic name will be dragged through the mud. For 3 long, desolate decades following the catastrophic collapse of Norton Villiers' Triumph in the late 1970s, the once unapproachable Norton Empire exists as nothing more than a ghost. The legendary name is reduced to a fragmented trademark, tossed around in obscure legal battles and slapped onto cheap, nostalgic merchandise. There are brief, sputtering attempts to resuscitate the brand, most notably by an ambitious American restorer named Kenny Dreer in the early 2000s. Operating out of Oregon, Dreer pours his heart and his life savings into redesigning the classic Commando for the modern age. He produces a stunning, modernized prototype that captures the aggressive, muscular soul of the original machine. But the brutal economics of motorcycle manufacturing remain unchanged. Dreer simply runs out of capital before mass production can begin, his ambitious dream quietly folding in 2006. The Norton name goes back into the dark vault, seemingly destined to remain a tragic footnote in the grand history of industrial failure. The world assumes the empire is dead and permanently buried. But in 2008, a remarkably charismatic, sharply dressed British businessman named Stuart Garner steps out of the shadows and onto the global stage. Garner is not a greasy-handed traditional motorcycle engineer from the old Birmingham factories. He is a modern entrepreneur, an incredibly persuasive salesman who had previously made his fortune selling fireworks and gamekeeping equipment. Armed with immense personal ambition and an almost hypnotic level of confidence, Garner successfully purchases the global trademark rights for Norton motorcycles from its American owners. He makes a bold, headline-grabbing promise to the motorcycling world. He is bringing the legendary British crown jewel back home. Garner understands a fundamental truth about the modern luxury market that the stubborn directors of the 1970s never grasped. He knows that he is not just selling a 2-wheeled vehicle to compete with highly efficient Japanese commuters. He is selling an emotion. He is selling a premium, elite British lifestyle. To sell a high-end aristocratic fantasy, you cannot build motorcycles in a dreary, soot-stained industrial park in the Midlands. You need a stage that matches the grandeur of the legend. In a masterstroke of theatrical branding, Garner acquires the lease for Donington Hall in Leicestershire. This is not a factory, it is a sprawling, magnificent 18th-century Gothic revival mansion, complete with sweeping manicured driveways, a private deer park, and grand wood-paneled staterooms. Garner moves the entire Norton operation onto the castle grounds. The newly constructed assembly facility, situated just behind the historic manor, is meticulously designed to project an image of absolute, uncompromising quality. It is a pristine, brightly lit, clinical environment where highly skilled British craftsmen in clean uniforms assemble motorcycles by hand. When the motorcycling press is invited to Donington Hall, they are completely swept away by the overwhelming romance of it all. They do not see the grim, striking labor unions or the oil-stained, crumbling brick walls of the past. They see a visionary leader standing in front of a majestic castle, passionately speaking about restoring British pride, utilizing local suppliers, and preserving the sacred art of mechanical craftsmanship. It is the ultimate redemption story, beautifully packaged and perfectly timed. Garner positions Norton as the two-wheeled equivalent of Aston Martin, a bespoke, intensely desirable luxury product built for the discerning gentleman rider. The dark, humiliating days of the 1970s are officially declared over. The unapproachable master has awakened from its long slumber, and the world is absolutely eager to believe in the magic. The physical manifestation of this grand revival is the Norton Commando 961. Evolving from the American prototypes, but heavily refined for the European market, the new Commando is an absolute visual masterpiece. It perfectly threads the needle between vintage nostalgia and modern aggression. It features the beautiful, sweeping fiberglass lines and the iconic, sculpted fuel tank that made the 1968 original so famous, but it is entirely stripped of the antiquated flaws. There are no oil leaks. It features premium Ulan suspension, massive Brembo brakes, and a roaring, fuel-injected parallel twin engine that rumbles with a deep, authoritative baritone. When the very first production models roll out of the Donington Hall gates, the global reception is rapturous. Nostalgic riders and wealthy collectors immediately open their checkbooks, placing massive cash deposits just to secure a place on the incredibly long waiting list. The glittering success of the new Norton perfectly aligns with a desperate political climate. Following the devastating global financial crash of 2008, the British government is aggressively searching for positive, uplifting stories of domestic manufacturing resurgence. They want to prove to the world that Britain still builds world-class things. Stuart Garner, with his sharp suits, his historic castle, and his beautiful motorcycles, becomes the ultimate political poster boy. He is universally hailed as an industrial hero. High-ranking government ministers, including Chancellor George Osborne, make highly publicized, smiling visits to the Donington Hall production line, wearing high-visibility jackets and praising Garner's brilliant entrepreneurship in front of flashing news cameras. The UK government, completely blinded by the flawless public relations narrative, pours millions of pounds in taxpayer-funded grants and guaranteed export loans directly into the company to supposedly help them expand their workforce and develop new technology. Garner pushes the hype machine to the absolute limit by announcing the ultimate return to the company's sacred roots. Norton is going back to the Isle of Man TT. Developing a ferocious, highly advanced V4-powered superbike, the company returns to the treacherous mountain course that forged their legend a century earlier. When the silver and black Norton race bikes thunder down the Bray Hill, Straight at 200 miles per hour, driven by elite racers, the emotional impact on the British public is profound. Grown men weep on the grassy banks of the track, listening to the glorious, deafening roar of a factory Norton echoing through the valleys once again. To the outside observer, the financial press, and the eager customers waiting for their hand-built machines, the picture is absolutely flawless. The order books are completely full, the government is writing massive checks, the brand is racing at the highest levels of global motorsport, and a visionary CEO is comfortably holding court in a medieval castle. Stuart Garner has seemingly achieved the impossible. He has resurrected a dead empire, cured the systemic diseases of the British motorcycle industry, and built an unassailable fortress of modern luxury. But it is all a magnificent, carefully orchestrated illusion. Behind the heavy oak doors of Donington Hall, hidden far away from the flashing cameras of the political elite and the cheering crowds of the racetrack, the very foundation of the company is built on quicksand. The glittering surface is about to crack, revealing a terrifying labyrinth of unpaid bills, desperate assembly floor cannibalization, and a financial betrayal so deep and so cruel that it will make the corporate mismanagement of the 1970s look like a minor accounting error. Behind the magnificent, ivy-covered stone facade of Donington Hall, the daily reality for Norton's workforce was rapidly devolving into an industrial nightmare. The glossy sales brochures and glowing magazine reviews painted a picture of thriving, elite British craftsmanship, but the actual assembly floor was operating in a state of perpetual, desperate crisis. The root of the problem was a catastrophic, completely unsustainable lack of liquid cash. Despite the massive influx of government manufacturing grants and the hefty, non-refundable cash deposits collected from eager customers around the world, the company was consistently bleeding money. Norton owed millions to its vast network of external parts suppliers. Frustrated by months of unpaid invoices, bounced checks, and broken promises, these critical suppliers eventually issued a devastating ultimatum. They would no longer deliver essential components like engine blocks, braking systems, or electrical harnesses without cash paid strictly up front. Almost overnight, the global supply chain completely evaporated. The pristine assembly line at Donington Hall ground to an agonizing halt. Highly skilled workers arrived for their shifts, only to stand around empty, silent workstations, lacking the basic bolts, wheels, and wiring needed to finish the motorcycles. Yet the pressure from Stuart Garner and the executive team to deliver finished bikes to the press and VIP clients remained unrelenting. To keep the grand illusion of production alive, management instituted a clandestine practice that severely violated the most basic ethical codes of manufacturing. They began cannibalizing their own products. When loyal customers brought their previously purchased Norton motorcycles back to the Donington factory for routine maintenance, minor warranty repairs, or software updates, those bikes were not carefully serviced and returned. Instead, they were quietly rolled to the dark back corners of the facility and systematically stripped for parts. Mechanics were directly ordered by their superiors to take expensive, critical components like suspension forks, fuel injectors, and brake calipers off the customer-owned service bikes and install them onto new motorcycles sitting on the stalled assembly line. Those newly assembled Frankenstein machines were then hurriedly shipped out to pacify the loudest, most angry buyers who had been threatening legal action after waiting years for their orders. Meanwhile, the original customers whose bikes had been stripped were strung along with endless, fabricated excuses about why their routine service was taking months to complete, completely unaware that their personal property had been harvested to build someone else's machine. For the deeply passionate engineers and mechanics working on the floor, this was profoundly soul-crushing. They had joined Norton because they genuinely believed in the romantic revival of a British legend, but they found themselves acting as unwilling accomplices in a desperate corporate shell game. As the chaotic cannibalization accelerated, quality control plummeted to terrifying lows. The flagship V4SS superbikes, machines that retailed for tens of thousands of pounds and were aggressively marketed as the absolute pinnacle of racing technology, were shipped to customers with catastrophic, life-threatening defects. Independent investigations and horrified owners would later reveal that these elite motorcycles suffered from leaking oil systems, faulty chassis welds that could snap under stress, and compromised cooling systems that could spray scalding liquid directly onto the rear tire at highway speeds. The old, dark ghosts of the 1970s, unpredictable reliability, oil leaks, and dangerous mechanical failure, had returned to haunt the brand. Only this time, they were wrapped in expensive carbon fiber and hidden behind the aristocratic walls of a medieval castle. But as disastrous as the manufacturing crisis was, it was merely the mechanical symptom of a much darker, far more sinister financial disease festering in the CEO's office. If the assembly lines were perpetually stalled and the company was suffocating under mounting supplier debt, a glaring, terrifying question remained. How was Stuart Garner actually keeping the lights on at Donington Hall? How was he maintaining the sprawling deer park, driving a fleet of luxury Aston Martins, and projecting the flawless, untouchable image of a spectacularly wealthy industrial tycoon? The answer lay in one of the most audacious and devastating financial betrayals in modern British corporate history. Garner had found a way to quietly bypass traditional banks, who were highly skeptical of his balance sheets, and sophisticated venture capitalists, who would demand to look at the books. He decided to fund his failing motorcycle empire using the life savings of the British public. Between 2012 and 2013, Garner orchestrated the creation of 3 separate, highly questionable pension schemes. Working alongside associates who employed aggressive, high-pressure telemarketing tactics, the operation systematically targeted ordinary, hard-working people across the United Kingdom. These targets were not wealthy investors or high-risk financial gamblers. They were mechanics, nurses, teachers, and factory workers who had spent their entire adult lives diligently saving for retirement. Many of them had absolutely no interest in motorcycles and had never even heard of the historic Norton brand. They were cold-called at their homes and smoothly persuaded to transfer their hard-earned employer pension pots, often representing decades of grueling physical labor, into these new schemes. They were lured by the promise of safe, tax-efficient, and mathematically guaranteed financial returns. In total, 228 individuals transferred roughly £14 million into the Norton pension funds. What these vulnerable people did not know was that Stuart Garner had appointed himself as the sole, autonomous trustee of these funds. He held absolute, unchecked legal control over millions of pounds of other people's money. Almost immediately upon receiving the transfers, Garner systematically drained the pension accounts, funneling the vast majority of the cash directly into the Norton Motorcycles business as a massive, unregulated slush fund. He was not investing their money in a diversified, secure portfolio to guarantee their future. He was legally binding their ultimate survival to a fundamentally broken, heavily indebted manufacturing company that was secretly cannibalizing its own products just to stay afloat. For years, this stolen £14 million served as a vital financial tourniquet, artificially keeping the illusion of the Norton revival alive. It paid for the expensive marketing campaigns, the glamorous VIP events at the castle, and the high-profile racing efforts at the Isle of Man TT that kept the politicians smiling and the press blindly cheering. But a corporate structure built entirely on misappropriated funds mathematically cannot survive forever. The inevitable collapse began when the earliest investors reached their legal retirement age and formally requested to withdraw their life savings. When the pensioners knocked on the castle doors, asking for the money they desperately needed to survive their twilight years, they were met with a terrifying wall of silence. Garner and his executive team deployed a relentless, cruel campaign of evasion. They ignored frantic phone calls, refused to answer certified letters, and offered a continuous stream of hollow, fabricated excuses regarding administrative delays and banking errors. As months turned into years, sheer panic began to spread among the 228 victims. Many were forced to cancel their retirement plans entirely, taking on menial, physically demanding jobs in their late 60s and 70s just to pay their winter heating bills. Some suffered severe mental health breakdowns, while others passed away before ever seeing a single penny of their money returned. Meanwhile, the man who controlled their life savings continued to pose for magazine covers in bespoke suits, standing proudly next to motorcycles he could not actually afford to build. The glittering mirage of Donington Hall was rapidly evaporating, and the dark, inescapable reality of the fraud was finally bleeding into the light. The unapproachable master was no longer just a failing business. It was an active crime scene waiting to be raided. The dawn of the new decade brings a bitter, freezing winter to Leicestershire, and with it, the absolute collapse of Stuart Garner's elaborate illusion. By late 2019, the financial pressure on Donington Hall has become mathematically impossible to manage, let alone conceal. The deafening whispers of unpaid suppliers, furious customers demanding refunds, and desperately delayed wages have finally reached the ears of the mainstream British press. Investigative journalists, who had previously been entirely sidelined by the glowing, patriotic public relations narrative, begin aggressively pulling at the loose threads of the Norton Empire. They uncover a staggering mountain of unpaid taxes owed to HM Revenue and Customs. Metrobank, the primary financial institution that had extended massive credit lines to Garner based on highly questionable business valuations, abruptly loses its patience. The bank realizes that the company is completely hollow. The millions of pounds in government grants, the massive customer deposits, and the stolen pension funds have all been incinerated in a desperate bid to keep the assembly lines moving at a crawl. The house of cards is trembling violently, and it requires only a single, decisive push to bring the entire structure crashing down to the earth. That push arrives on the morning of January 29, 2020. The scene that unfolds is the exact tragic moment that will forever define the darkest chapter in British motorcycling history. Without warning, representatives from the accounting firm BDO arrive at the sprawling Donington Hall estate. They are not there to quietly audit the books or offer financial restructuring advice. They have been officially appointed as administrators. Their legal mandate is absolute and immediate. They strip Stuart Garner of all executive power and seize total physical control of the Norton Motorcycles operation. The bewildered workforce, many of whom have spent the last few years enduring toxic working conditions simply because they deeply believed in the legendary brand, are hastily gathered on the freezing factory floor. The administrators deliver the cold, clinical truth. The company is completely insolvent. There is no money left. The workers are ordered to pack up their personal tools, leave the premises immediately, and go home. As the shocked mechanics and engineers walk down the long, manicured driveway for the final time, the heavy iron gates of the castle are chained shut behind them. For the second time in half a century, the unapproachable master has been abruptly, violently silenced. But the physical closure of the factory is only the beginning of the nightmare. When the BDO administrators finally pry open the locked filing cabinets and dive into the corporate ledgers, they do not find a struggling business that simply suffered from poor market conditions. They uncover an absolute financial massacre. The accounting records are a chaotic, terrifying labyrinth of missing funds, massive liabilities, and shocking corporate negligence. Norton Motorcycles owes tens of millions of pounds to a vast, angry network of creditors. there are hundreds of furious customers scattered across the globe who have paid in full for expensive V4 superbikes and Commando twins that will never, ever be built. There are small, independent British manufacturing suppliers who have been pushed to the absolute brink of their own bankruptcy because Norton systematically refused to pay their invoices for years. The administrators walk through the silent, frozen assembly hall and catalog the grim reality of the cannibalized motorcycles, the rusting frames, and the half-finished engines that tell a silent story of profound manufacturing desperation and deceit. However, the most devastating discovery is the absolute, undeniable confirmation of the pension fraud. The dark rumors that had been quietly circulating among desperate retirees are officially validated by the government's pensions ombudsman. The exhaustive investigations reveal that Stuart Garner had acted with staggering dishonesty. The £14 million belonging to 228 ordinary, hard-working people had been funneled directly into the failing business and entirely wiped out. When the news officially breaks across the nation, the human cost of the collapse becomes almost unbearable to witness. These victims are not wealthy venture capitalists who took a calculated market risk. They are elderly citizens who had trusted a charismatic CEO with their very survival. They are forced to sit in their living rooms, watching the evening news broadcasts show the chained gates of Donington Hall, realizing with absolute horror that their life savings are completely gone. The agonizing wait for answers turns into a permanent, devastating reality. The immense stress, the public humiliation, and the sudden, crushing threat of poverty inflict a severe psychological and physical toll on the victims. Garner's spectacular downfall is swift, but it offers very little comfort or restitution to the people he destroyed. The pensions ombudsman issues a scathing, fiercely worded ruling, officially ordering Garner to personally repay the £14 million he had misappropriated from the retirement funds. But the money simply does not exist anymore. Garner, the man who had previously posed for magazine covers alongside high-ranking politicians and boasted of reviving a national treasure, quickly declares personal bankruptcy. He vacates the magnificent Donington Hall, leaving behind a toxic, burning crater of debt, shattered lives, and completely ruined reputations. The politicians who had eagerly used the Norton brand for their own patriotic photo opportunities immediately distanced themselves, remaining entirely silent as the wreckage of the company is brutally exposed to the world. The historic Norton badge, an emblem that had once struck fear into the hearts of rival racing teams and stood as the ultimate symbol of British engineering supremacy, is now completely synonymous with white-collar crime, deception, and unimaginable corporate cruelty. The empire is dead once again, but this time it has taken the innocent along with it into the abyss. In the immediate suffocating aftermath of the BDO administration, the physical and reputational wreckage of Norton motorcycles is left fully exposed to the elements. The magnificent Donington Hall is emptied, sitting as a hollow monument to Stuart Garner's catastrophic vanity. The legendary brand is now completely toxic. The financial industry views Norton not as a proud British heritage asset, but as an active crime scene permanently stained by the £14 million pension fraud and millions more in unpaid supplier debts. The global motorcycling community, deeply betrayed and heartbroken, assumes that this is the absolute definitive end. The unapproachable master has finally been euthanized by its own greed. Who in their right mind would willingly purchase a disgraced, bankrupt company with a completely shattered supply chain, a furious customer base, and an assembly line full of dangerously defective motorcycles? For a brief, terrifying moment in the spring of 2020, it appears that the 122-year-old history of Norton will be sold off for scrap metal. But history, particularly industrial history, has a profound sense of irony. In April 2020, right in the middle of a paralyzing global pandemic, a shocking announcement reverberates through the business world. Norton Motorcycles has been saved. It is acquired in an all-cash deal worth £16 million. However, the financial savior does not arrive from a wealthy British investment firm, an aristocratic European consortium, or an aggressive American venture capitalist. The savior arrives from Chennai. TVS Motor Company, an absolute manufacturing titan in India that produces millions of two-wheeled vehicles every single year, purchases the shattered remains of the British Empire. The historical poetry of this transaction is staggering. The mighty British motorcycle industry, which had spent the entire 20th century looking down on the rest of the world with supreme, unshakable arrogance, had entirely collapsed under the weight of its own conservative pride. Now, to survive the 21st century, it requires the massive capital, the clinical operational expertise, and the absolute industrial discipline of a company from its former colony. The empire is being saved by the East. When the newly appointed executives from TVS physically step into the Donington Hall factory to assess their new acquisition, they are met with a scene of unimaginable industrial horror. They do not just find a struggling production line, they find a complete mechanical graveyard. They uncover the dark reality of the cannibalized motorcycles, the severely compromised V4 engine blocks, and the chaotic, completely undocumented engineering processes that Garner's management had desperately utilized to keep the illusion alive. TVS realizes that the Norton name is entirely worthless if they cannot restore the absolute trust of the global motorcycling community. In a highly unusual and profoundly honorable corporate maneuver, the Indian megacorporation makes a massive multi-million-pound commitment to fix the sins of the past. Legally, under the terms of the administration buyout, TVS has absolutely no obligation to honor the massive deposits lost by Garner's previous customers or to fix the dangerously defective motorcycles that had already been shipped. But ethically, they understand that the brand cannot move forward until the bleeding stops. TVS initiates an exhaustive, agonizingly detailed review of the flagship V4 Superbike. They discover no fewer than 35 critical, life-threatening engineering defects in the machine that Stuart Garner had proudly touted as the pinnacle of British racing technology. Rather than quietly burying the problem, TVS engineers completely redesign the motorcycle from the ground up to ensure it is actually safe to ride. They begin the monumental, incredibly expensive process of tracking down the furious customers who had paid Garner tens of thousands of pounds and received nothing. Slowly, methodically, they begin building and delivering the motorcycles that were promised years ago, effectively absorbing massive financial losses just to wash the toxic stain off the Norton badge. They are not merely buying a brand, they are actively paying down its immense karmic debt. To permanently sever ties with the dark, deceptive era of the castle, TVS makes a crucial, highly symbolic decision. They completely abandon the aristocratic fantasy of Donington Hall. They pack up the surviving machinery and move the entire operation to a brand new, state-of-the-art, hyper-clinical manufacturing facility in Solihull, near the historic heart of the British automotive industry. The new factory does not have a deer park, sweeping staircases, or wood-paneled staterooms. It has brightly lit, surgically clean assembly lines, rigorous digital quality control stations, and a corporate culture entirely focused on absolute engineering precision rather than glamorous public relations. The romanticized, chaotic era of men hitting metal with hammers in the dark is officially over. Norton is finally dragged, kicking and screaming, into the modern industrial age by the very international competitors it once arrogantly dismissed as disposable. The legacy of Norton Motorcycles is a deeply complicated, often painful narrative of mechanical brilliance, consistently betrayed by blinding human hubris. It survived the violent devastation of 2 world wars, only to be dismantled from the inside by an aristocratic boardroom that absolutely refused to adapt to the rising sun in the 1970s. Decades later, when the world was eager to welcome its triumphant return, it was brutally exploited and hollowed out by a charismatic fraudster who weaponized national pride to steal the life savings of ordinary working people. The fact that the Norton name survives today, humming quietly in a pristine, Indian-owned factory in Solihull, is an incredible testament to the enduring, almost mythical power of those original, unapproachable machines. But the roaring exhaust notes will forever carry the heavy, haunting echoes of the men who lost their jobs on the picket lines of Meriden and the devastated pensioners who lost their entire futures behind the heavy, chained gates of Donington Hall. The story of Norton motorcycles is far more than a simple chronological record of an industrial decline. It is a profound, cautionary masterclass on the fatal consequences of corporate hubris and the devastating human cost of absolute greed. For over a century, the Norton badge represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. It was a symbol forged in the deafening fires of 2 world wars and polished on the treacherous, winding mountain roads of the Isle of Man TT. But a legacy, no matter how magnificent, is not a permanent shield against the relentless march of time. The conservative British executives of the 1970s fundamentally misunderstood this truth. They believed that past racing victories granted them permanent immunity from future innovation, arrogantly dismissing the highly automated, reliable machines rising from the east until it was mathematically too late to adapt. They chose blind pride over necessary progress, and that arrogance cost thousands of highly skilled men their livelihoods. Yet the second collapse under Stuart Garner reveals a much darker, far more sinister truth about modern capitalism. The tragedy at Donington Hall proves that when a historic brand is hollowed out and weaponized purely for aesthetic nostalgia, it ceases to be a manufacturing company. It becomes a mirage. Garner did not just destroy a business. He fundamentally violated the sacred, unwritten social contract between a company and its community. By exploiting the deep patriotism of the British public and systematically draining the life savings of vulnerable pensioners to fund his own aristocratic fantasy, he transformed an engineering legend into a cold vehicle for human misery. Today, as the Norton name quietly rebuilds under the clinical, highly disciplined ownership of India's TVS Motor Company, the roaring exhaust notes of the new machines carry a complex, heavy resonance. They are a testament to the fact that brilliant engineering can eventually be salvaged, but shattered human lives and stolen retirements cannot be easily repaired on an assembly line. The unapproachable master rides again, but it leaves behind a long, haunting shadow of the men and women who paid the ultimate price for its survival. What are your thoughts on the catastrophic fall and the unexpected rescue of Norton motorcycles? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into industrial history compelling, please subscribe to the channel for more documentaries on the empires that built our world and the tragic missteps that tore them apart.